All right, welcome everyone. We're going to give folks another minute or so to trickle in, but welcome. We're so glad you're all here. Um, Please be reminded that this is a webinar style Zoom link and meeting, so you won't be able to use the chat feature, but we will talk a little bit more about how to submit your questions once everybody has joined. For those of you just joining, we're just giving it another minute or so to let some additional folks into the webinar, so we will get started shortly. All right, I think in the interest of time, so that we have plenty of time for our presenters to present and also to have all of you ask questions, we'll go ahead and get started. So, a little bit of housekeeping, as I mentioned initially, first of all, this webinar is being recorded, so please know that. Questions, please use the Q&A function to type your questions throughout the webinar. However, we're going to wait until all three of our presenters have presented before we go ahead and start to answer those questions. Because this is webinar style, regular chat will be unavailable, so you should not see that. At the end, we will be sharing an evaluation that we would ask you all to please take. It takes just a few minutes and it'll really help us to understand if this was a valuable webinar for all of you, which I hope it will be. Okay, so welcome. Today's seminar is called State of the Practice, Setting and Communicating PFAS Fish Consumption Advisories in Other States. If you are not aware, if this is your first webinar that you've joined, this is the third in a series of three that we have done. My colleague Liz will go ahead and explain a little bit more about our motivation in just a moment. But first, I want to introduce our facilitation team. So we have two groups that are partnering and facilitating to make these webinars happen. We have Dr. Katie May, who is the co-director of the Community Engagement Core over at NC State Center for Human Health and the Environment. I am Kiara Klein. I'm the program coordinator for Duke University Superfund Research Center's Community Engagement Core. Katie and I are joined by Lacey Brown, Community Engagement Specialist for the CHHE, Dr. Liz Shapiro Garza, who is the Director of Community Engagement for Duke Superfund, and Megan Hort Hughes, who is the Senior Program Coordinator for Research Translation. I will turn it over now to Liz to explain why we have chosen to put on these three webinars.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. Recognizing that this is may seem a fairly niche concern, why are we here talking about a fish consumption and subsistence fish consumption here in North Carolina? And why PFAS? Well, as we know, there are North Carolina has one of the most extensive waterways, freshwater waterway systems in the United States. And because of that, there is a long tradition here among folks who have lived here for generations and also new immigrants or newer immigrants of catching and consuming fish from our extensive waterways. Because of that, and because of the history of industrialization in the state and agricultural industrialization as well, uh, there are significant health concerns by the for the folks who are consuming fish from our waterways. This has only been exacerbated more recently with the discovery of significant quantities of PFAS of various types in our waterways. This discovery started out in the Cape Fear Re River region, primarily in the lower Cape Fear River region, which is the largest watershed in our entire state. With the discovery of Gen X PFAS in the waterway starting in about 2010, it has become apparent that PFAS compounds of various types again are being found in greater quantities throughout our waterways. This, of course, gets into the fish, which then gets into all of the people who are catching and eating the fish from our waterways. It is a significant health concern. And as we have heard in previous webinars, it is far outweighs the other types of contaminants that are of health concern that have been found in fish throughout our waterways. We're extremely grateful that we have been joined today by folks who really have extensive experience from other states in conducting the risk assessment and then setting and communicating fish consumption advisories. This again, PFAS are emergent contaminants or emergent concern of health concern. And so the science is new. The risk assessment that needs to be based on that science is relatively new. And what we know is that we need more communication, coordination, cooperation among the folks primarily at the state level, but also through the EPA, who are working on these issues. So that's why we are together today, is we are coordinating, we're communicating, and we're sharing best practices, again, in this emerging concern, in this vital issue for North Carolina and for every state that has people who are catching and consuming fish from our waterways. Thank you so much for joining us today.
And thank you, Liz. Great. So now we'll introduce our three amazing panelists we're really fortunate to have. They will be presenting each one at a time for between 5, 7 minutes. So we'll get to hear a bit about each person's background, what they work on currently, and what they're offering to today's webinar. So first we have Erica Bloom. Erica Bloom is the Toxics Campaign Director at the Ecology Center based out of Michigan. Her work focuses on protecting human health and the environment from toxic chemicals with an emphasis on supporting communities impacted by PFAS contamination. She works with the Ecology Center's research and communication team to conduct campaign-connected science on PFAS in fish, soils, water, and air. Through community organizing and coalition building, she aims to increase public awareness and action on PFAS. Welcome, Erica. Next, we have Dr. Brandon Armstrong. Dr. Armstrong is an aquatic biology specialist for the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, also known as EGLE or EAGLE, and is the coordinator of Michigan's Fish Contaminant Monitoring Program. This program assesses biocumulative contaminants, including PFAS, in fish tissue from water bodies throughout the state, and provides data to inform the fish consumption advisories issued by the Michigan's Department of Health and Human Services Eat Safe Fish program. He is responsible for developing an annual monitoring plan, analyzing and interpreting fish contaminant data, and serving as Eagle's liaison between various university, federal, state, tribal, and provincial agency partners regarding chemical contaminants in fish. Welcome, Brandon. Last but not least, we have Carly. Carly Brown is a program manager with the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services supporting the Eat Safe Fish program. She works with her program team to put forth environmental health data in clear, accessible guidance that helps people make informed decisions about eating locally caught fish. Her responsibilities include guiding Eat Safe Fish engagement efforts, supporting the interpretation of fish contaminant information for public audiences, and collaborating with state agencies, toxicologists, and community partners on advisory communication. So we are going to have our presenters present in this order. And so I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to turn it over to Erica.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so I can share my slides with you all. Give me one moment to do that. Okay. Everybody see this?
Yep.
Okay, thanks. Okay, well, again, thanks for having me. And I'm representing the Ecology Center today, but also the Great Lakes PFAS Action Network, which I'm going to talk about. So yes, I'm the Toxics Campaign Director at the Ecology Center, and through that role, I help support and co-lead the Great Lakes PFAS Action Network. The Ecology Center, we do a lot of environmental health, climate, justice, air quality, toxics work. We're based out of Michigan and really work statewide. And the Great Lakes PFAS Action Network is a coalition of PFAS impacted communities supported by environmental organizations and conservation groups. This picture is of me with some of our partners and anglers that we did a community-based research study looking at PFAS in fish. So that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about, and I'll get going. So in 2022, the Ecology Center partnered with 6 local anglers and the Huron River Watershed Council and Friends of the Rouge in a community-based participatory research study. So a few years before that, the state of Michigan issued a do not eat the fish advisory for parts of the Huron River. And people who use the river had questions about what advisories meant for fishing and recreation, which fish species and locations were contaminated, and what exactly were PFAS. So a few years after that advisory, we approached this project really thinking about a community-based participatory, model. This model values lived experiences and expertise from community members. It brings research happening in their own communities. So we worked directly with people who are fishing the water bodies. And it's important to do that when developing communication around risk and recommendations. We aimed to understand where people are most likely to fish in the Huron and Rouge rivers, and we focused our collection in those areas. And one thing I should mention is those rivers are in Southeast Michigan, so that's really where this study was focused. So talking about advisories, restrictive fish consumption advisories can be disruptive to cultural and traditional relationships with the waters, but they're really important because they allow anglers to make informed decisions in order to balance the risks and benefits of consuming fish that contain PFAS and other toxins. So we were thinking a lot about that in terms of messaging and who we were working with. In this study, we worked with anglers to collect over 100 fish from 15 locations in the Huron and Rouge watersheds. Our study analyzed whole fish for 40 different PFAS chemicals. The PFAS parts per billion number is the sum of 40 PFAS chemicals for a single homogenized fish. And we know fish consumption advisories are set by PFOS levels and fillets in our state. But this study tested the whole fish and a broader set of PFAS. We wanted to give a comprehensive look at PFAS in the ecosystem. And we used, watershed maps to really visualize our study results. And this is an example of one of those. So as a result of our study, we produced a digital and printed brochure that included a graphic map to visualize PFAS levels in fish. So as I said, I'm with an environmental health organization, and we think a lot about communicating complex science and health data to the public. And we often think about people's connection to place, including watersheds and local rivers and lakes. We believe that people often best understand research and data and important health information when coupled with powerful narrative and personal stories. So we worked with our communications director to highlight why some of these anglers got involved in our study, alongside, really visually appealing maps to localize the data. So even though this was about communicating, scientific research, not the fish advisories specifically, I think a lot of the concepts are transferable, and the graphics and the photos and the stories really drew people in and got the attention, and so that we could then direct people to the state websites and the consumption advisories. So I wanted to talk a bit about a mapping project we did a few years after that study. So last year in 2025, the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services released updated Eat Safe Fish guides, which you'll hear about, to help residents understand which types of fish can be harmful to health, and make informed decisions regarding their fish consumption. So again, we were really thinking about how to draw attention to these advisories using place-based communication that could connect anglers and the public and even lawmakers to familiar water bodies or water bodies in the districts that they represented. So using the publicly available PFOS fish consumption advisory data from the state, we created this interactive map to highlight new and existing fish consumption advisories and do not eat advisories due to PFOS. So I did want to just spend a couple minutes showing you what this map looked like. And this is the website in case anyone would like to go here on your own. It's on our Great Lakes PFAS Action Network website under resources. And so it's interactive, so you could zoom in. The red triangles are water bodies that have do not eat advisories for fish species, and the yellow are consumption, so monthly servings. There are some that have both red and yellow, and that means that those are water bodies that have advisories and do not eat. So I could show you one example. This is in Lake Pleasant, which is just north of a city called Jackson in southern Michigan. It's a very rural area. When you click on the button, you can see that there's consumption advisories for bluegill and sunfish, but do not eats for bass, in this location. And you can also see who the state and federal representatives are. So that's one way to search the map. Another way is to actually just search by a water body that you know. So if I were to search Ford Lake, which is a lake right by my house in Michigan, I can see that that lake has a do not eat advisory. And I could see that that's actually for all species, and the state is really saying don't eat the fish due to PFOS. And I want to be clear that this map is really just showing the PFOS advisories, and that we tried to be very communicative about there's other advisories for other chemicals, but that people would need to go to the Eat Safe Fish guide, and we have a direct link back to that website. They would also have to go back there to know like how many servings per month if there was an advisory. One other way to search this is by, if you're a lawmaker or you're meeting with your lawmaker and you want to show what district, you could search that. So I'll search my representative. His name is Jimmy Wilson Jr. And if you search for him, the map will highlight his district. And then you could see, or he could see directly, hey, I have a do not eat advisory in my district. It's right on Ford Lake. And it's a really good way to kind of communicate that, because it's, again, going back to place-based communication. I think people, that resonates if they know a place or it's some place that they can visually see. So that was one of the, some of the main reasons we made this map. The other thing about the map I just want to highlight is that you can really see visually where some of the trends are and the clusters around, in Southeast Michigan or in the southern part of the state, it's more industrialized. So there's more advisories. In the northern part, there's some consumption advisories, but fewer do not eats. So, you have the website now, and you can, go there yourself and see how that might work for you. But that's where I'll end my presentation right now, and I'm happy to answer questions, or you can email me. And those are the websites that, for my organizations. I'll stop sharing now.
Thanks so much, Erica. That was excellent. Really looking forward to digging into some of what you just shared. Just a reminder to everyone to please use the Q&A function. It should be at the bottom of your screen. But just remember that we will not actually be answering questions until all three panelists have presented. So with that, I will pass it over to Brandon.
All right, thank you. I'm going to share my screen. All right, hopefully those slides popped up for you.
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, yeah, I'm Brandon Armstrong. I'm an aquatic biologist with Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, or short for EAGLE, and I coordinate the fish contaminant monitoring program. Just a little bit of background on me. I'm a student at Michigan State University, fisheries and wildlife for both my master's and bachelor's. For my master's, I assessed the impacts of ammonia and 17-alpha phenylestradiol, or the active ingredient in birth control, on fish reproduction. Came back and got my PhD in environmental toxicology, and I developed computational models to scale sublethal effects of stressors, such as chemical perturbations to the reproductive axis or changes to fish behavior, and how those small sublethal stressors may manifest to much larger population relevant outcomes like changes in recruitment, for example. And then I started my first job was with US EPA contractor. I was based in Cincinnati, Ohio. I conducted a lot of the fish and aquatic macroinvertebrate toxicity testing for EPA and collected fish across the state of Ohio for different chemical contaminant monitoring assessments. And I started here with EAGLE back in 2017, started as a toxicologist, where I drove the surface water quality values for the state and coordinated the Michigan surface water PFAS monitoring program for the Water Resources Division of EAGLE. And then I transferred over to as an aquatic biologist here, where I've been coordinating the fish contaminant monitoring program since 2020. Before I get into the fish contaminant monitoring, I just wanted to talk about the Fish and Wildlife Contaminant Advisory Committee, or FWCAC, here in the state of Michigan. Several state agencies get together every year to talk about changes to upcoming fish consumption advisories that are issued by MDHHS. So the role for EAGLE within the FWCAC is to develop the annual monitoring plan, and then we go out and collect the fish across the state, send those fish off to the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services Bureau of Laboratories, where they do all the chemical analyses. The lab then sends us back the data. We do statistical analyses of that data, and then issue fish consumption recommendations to the MDHHS Eat Safe Fish program. MDHHS is where the Eat Safe Fish program is housed. They review our recommendations, and they ultimately make the final decisions for updating or changing the fish consumption advisories for the state. They also are responsible for deriving the fish consumption screening values, or FCSVs, which are the backbone for issuing those advisories. And Carly will talk about those after my talk. We also have partnering agencies within the state that help with the sample collection or input on data interpretation, particularly with migratory species, making sure that our consumption advisories for a particular water body are covering the appropriate part of the lake. Particularly with Great Lakes, how are fish moving throughout that system? Does one advisory make sense, or are multiple advisories needed for different sections of the water body? And that is done with discussions with the Michigan Department of Natural Resources, our federal agencies like USGS, or U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and also the tribes. And then we have an EAGLE targeted monitoring program. So every year, Eagle solicits requests for both internal and external requests for fish contaminant monitoring throughout the state. And that's where the public gets to play a role in determining where we're collecting fish throughout the state. They can say, if there's a particular resident that just moved to a new area, a fish consumption advisory has not been issued for that particular water body. They can submit one of these requests and say, we just want to make sure that the fish that I'm feeding my family are safe, and we can build that request into our annual monitoring plan in a future year. All right, so to talk about the fish contaminant monitoring program, what are the goals of the overall program? And that first one there, that's the most important. I'd say about 90% of the fish that we collect are looking at the edible portion, or the portion that most people are eating off of a fish, like a fillet. And so we collect fish throughout the state for this particular purpose, and that's to collect data for MDHHS to issue those fish consumption advisories. Eagle does occasionally collect whole fish for chemical monitoring. While whole fish data are not used to set fish consumption advisories, Eagle does use that data to evaluate trends in the water quality for those particular areas throughout the state. So every 5 years, we collect fish for looking at how our chemical concentration is changing over time. Are our remediation programs or our mitigation programs or permitting programs effectively removing chemical contamination from our water bodies? And hopefully we're seeing declining trends for some of these chemicals. One question we're often asked, what chemicals are you guys interested or looking at within the fish contaminant monitoring program? And we call these PBD chemicals. We're looking for chemicals that are persistent. They last a long time in the environment. B for bioaccumulative. They build up at much higher concentrations within the fish than the water that you're pulling them from. And then T for toxic. If you consume these chemicals at either a high frequency or high enough concentration, they can cause human health impacts down the road. And then we break these PBD chemicals into two different categories: legacy chemicals like mercury, PCBs, DDT, and dioxins. These are chemicals that have been in the environment for a long time. They've been studied for several decades. We really have a good understanding of their toxicity, of the bioaccumulative nature of these chemicals, and really where the sources lie within the state of Michigan. And then emerging chemicals like PFAS. While they've been in the environment for a long time, we're just really starting to understand how toxic or how bioaccumulative these chemicals can be. We've only been looking at PFAS for about 10 years here in the state of Michigan, at least within fish tissue. So when we go out to a site, what are our collection goals? And so to issue an advisory, MDHHS requires at least 5 individuals of a particular species, ideally 10 individuals across the size range that would be consumed by anglers. So we're looking for legal size individuals, and then up to 10 individuals for a particular species. And then really it's the chemical that we're concerned most about, which will determine which species we're testing. So if it's a new water body where we have not been out to before, and mercury is a global pollutant, we really want to target a top predator species like largemouth bass or walleye. That's because the higher you eat up on the food chain, the higher your mercury concentration will be. So species like largemouth bass and walleye are going to have much higher mercury concentrations than something that feeds lower in the food web, like a bluegill. PCBs and DDT, these are fat-loving chemicals. So the fattier fish or bottom benthic dwelling species like carp, catfish, lake trout, they're going to tend to have higher concentrations of these chemicals in their system compared to much leaner species like a walleye. And then for PFAS, well, we're not really seeing species dependent relationships. There's a few caveats to that. For example, we don't see much high concentrations of PFAS in catfish or in carp compared to other species. But we do, when there's a PFAS concern, we do want to target those panfish species like bluegill, rock bass, pumpkin seed, crappie. And that's because, MDHHS has a statewide advisory, or statewide guidelines for several species of fish that apply to waters that we have not tested before. And mercury concentrations in panfish really aren't that high compared to like largemouth bass. So the statewide advisory for a bluegill, for example, is only 8 meals per month. And a largemouth bass is much more restrictive, 2 meals or 1 meal per month, depending on the size of the fish. So it doesn't take a very high PFOS concentration to offset the statewide guidance that would be in place for a particular panfish species. So then how do we collect the fish? This is the fun part of the job. We go out, depending on the type of water body. The most common method that we use is use of electricity or electrofishing. So here on the top left, you can see our large electrofishing boat. This boat's going to put on an electrical field about 6 feet on either side of the boat and 10 feet down that temporarily stuns the fish, and it'll draw the fish to the surface where they can be netted. For much smaller systems, we have a very similar setup for wadable streams. This is our barge electrofishing tote. Same concept, sends out an electrical current, and those fish can be netted. And then for really small streams, we can use a backpack electrofishing unit. The picture on the bottom left, we don't do this too often, but we can set and deploy gill nets. The reason why we don't do this too often is it's not a very selective method for collecting fish. When we're only needing 10 fish for a particular species, you could end up killing a lot of non-target species or non-target individuals. So we really limit this to really deep lakes where we're trying to collect either larger size northern pike or lake trout that wouldn't be easily accessible through the use of electrofishing methods. And then more recently, we've expanded our collection to year-round sampling to keep up with the PFAS demand that's happening throughout the state. So we now are going out and using hook and line methods to collect fish in the wintertime, particularly in lakes where boating access isn't available. And then again, recently we started to get some funding through EPA, through GLRI, or Great Lakes Restoration Initiative funds, to start going to youth fishing events. And this has been a great addition to our program. It allows us to get out into the public. We go to these youth fishing events through our collaboration with Project Fish, or Friends Involved in Sport Fishing Heritage. And while at the event, the kids are collecting the fish for us. We ask for donations to the program. We tell them that, hey, we need 10 largemouth bass or 10 bluegill from this particular lake, and the kids are very excited to collect these for us. They bring all the fish they collect back to our tent, where we have a fillet table set up, and at the end of the event, we'll go through and have the kids help us weigh and measure the fish. We'll put on a little fillet demonstration to show them how we fillet fish for chemical contamination assessment. And then after that, usually a lot more with the younger kids, they like to poke around in the carcasses. And you see here a picture in the middle there. They can rip open their stomachs. We can help identify what critters those fish have been eating, and then also show them how to determine the sex of each fish. And then occasionally we'll take them through some of our electrofishing methods and show them how we collect fish for the program after that the event concludes. All right, so these next two figures are going to focus on what PFAS we're seeing in fish tissue, at least in the edible portion, again, fillet concentrations across the state. So this is looking at the last 3 years of data since 2021. In 2021, our lab updated their method to look at 39 different PFAS analytes. So we're also looking at linear. This is denoted by L- and branched isomers of PFOS, PFOA, and PFHXS. So linear PFOS and branch PFOS are the same chemical. However, their structures vary slightly. And you can see that linear PFOS is much more bioaccumulative than branch PFOS. When MDHHS issues fish consumption advisory, they're looking at the sum of both linear and branch PFOS to set that advisory. But overall, if you look at the total composition, so this is summing up all 39 analytes and looking at the average fillet of over 4,000 fish over the last 3 years, PFOS makes up over 73% of the total PFAS that we're seeing in the fillet. And then the next major players are some of the longer chain PFAS analytes like PFUNA, PFDOA, and PFDA. However, those are much lower composition when compared to PFOS. Not only does PFOS make up a higher composition of total PFAS in the fillet, PFOS is also detected at more frequency and at higher concentrations compared to the other PFAS in a particular fillet. So on the left axis here, we have percent detection. And on the right axis, we have concentration. So if you look at total PFAS, almost 98% of our fillets that we've tested, over 46,000 fillets, 98% of those have at least one PFAS analyte detected in the fillet. And then linear PFOS is about 94%. 94% of those fillets have detectable levels of linear PFOS. Also, again, much higher concentration. So on average, PFOS, linear PFOS is about 12 parts per billion. And compare that to the next highest detected analyte, PFUNA. PFUNA is only detected at about, on average, about 1 part per billion. So again, PFOS, much higher detection rates and much higher concentrations compared to these other PFAS, at least within fish tissue. With that, I think I'm gonna, I've got one more slide. So if you're interested in any of our data, we do house all of our surface water PFAS monitoring data. So I didn't touch on that today, but we do samples 3 to 5 watersheds each year for surface water PFAS monitoring, collecting anywhere from 40 to 100 water samples throughout that watershed. And so we have statewide data available for both surface water, and then all the fish contaminant monitoring data going back to 1979 are also on this website. If you Google Michigan PFAS Action and Response Team, or MPART, it'll take you to their homepage. You can look at the GIS viewer and then download all this data. So you can look at all the fish contaminant monitoring data that the health department is using to issue fish consumption advisories, as well as the surface water PFAS data. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carly to talk about how they use our data to issue those fish consumption advisories. Thank you.
Thanks, Brandon. Carly, you can go ahead and share whenever you're ready.
Awesome. Is everyone seeing my screen?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, I will go ahead and get started then. Hello, everyone. My name is Carly Brown. I am the program manager for the Michigan Eat Safe Fish program. As Brandon kind of went into the background and all of what it takes to get the science to my team here at Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, we take that science and we use it in our Eat Safe Fish program. And our main goal of our program is to identify the risks from the chemicals found in the environment that end up in fish. And we do this so Michigan residents can make good and empowered and informed decisions on making good choices for consuming fish here in Michigan. We support the consumption of fish, and I think it's so important for our program to really give the benefits and the risks of eating fish. There's chemicals in our water that have been around for quite some time, and unfortunately, it's a part of our industrial history. It's a part of a lot of our history here. And while there's obviously been a lot of actions taken to reduce the amount of chemicals that enter our water bodies throughout Michigan, there's still new chemicals being discovered today. And that's kind of our job to bring to the public, to make them aware and have them make good and safe choices for their fish consumption. Science is constantly improving, and we're always building our understanding of the different chemicals. As Brandon mentioned, there's persistent chemicals out there that are emerging, and PFAS was a big one that was emerging back in the early 2010s. I think we first started testing for it here in Michigan around 2020, 2012, I believe. And so our goal is to always work with our partners, get the science, and then make the science available to the public so they can make their best decisions. To give you an example, this is an outdated example. I'll give you that. This is from 2022 or 2022. Yep. And we are currently working on our 2026 guides. And so I want to mention that I don't want you to think that these current guidelines that you see here on the screen are updated, but I wanted to give you an example of what a page looks like in our Eat Safe Fish guide. So once all that science comes to us, we have two toxicologists as a part of our program here in Michigan. And what they do is look through all of that data that we get from Eagle and then decide if we need to put out guidelines for different water bodies. And so each water body has their own table. It's broken down by not only region. So as you can see here, Michigan, you can see we break it down into 5 regions: UP, Northwest, Northeast, Southeast, and Southwest. So we break it up that way, and then we break it up by county and then by water body to try to make it as simple as we can for people to find what they're looking for. But every single one of these fish advisories, so for example, the largemouth bass one for mercury and that size of fish, every single one of those is a group of data and science that comes to us that we are evaluating and deciding what fish consumption category that falls into. So every chemical, every some of the size fish that we receive, everything has a different kind of group that they're put into. And every year we look over all the updates and all the new science to make sure that these guides are as updated as possible. And we try to make it as simple as I can, again, to look at these. We have that map up top to kind of break down exactly where these water bodies are. So yeah, this is our big outcome of all that data that we're given is these guides. And these guides, again, they're updated regularly. They're updated by our program team here at Michigan Department of Human Health and Human Services. So this is the big outcome from all that data and all that science that we are given. But the big thing that we kind of do here in our Eat Safe Fish program is get the data to the public. So we work on getting this data in many ways. First is making a bunch of different tools that could be helpful for anyone, and these tools are able to be given as resources in various ways. We have our Eat Safe Fish guides not only on our website, but we also offer printed versions to anyone who wants them. People call in, we get emails, we make sure that residents can get a printed version if they need one. In addition to just our Eat Safe Fish guides, we also provide many other resources. We have Eat Safe Fish in Michigan. So that is a brochure about learning how to eat safe fish from other options. If it's not just caught, if you're buying safe fish, that type of stuff. And then again, our Buy Safe Fish, which tells residents how to buy safe fish, choose great options when they're going to purchase fish. So these are part of our tools in our toolbox, but a big way that these tools are able to get out into the public is through our outreach teams here at Michigan. We work with staff all across the state who are going to events, and they're going to fishing events, and they're going to, we send people out to local farmers markets and that type of stuff with these items so we can get them out to the public, because again, that's the big key here is getting all the science to the public so people can make their best informed decisions. So a big way is these three options and many more, which I'll kind of get into, but these are some books, some brochures, some hard copy things that we make sure that we can share with our public. Another way is our website. Our website is updated as we get new science, whether that be our guides or our recommendation sheets, which is the explanation of the science that goes into our guides. We also have buying fish, which would contain that like Buy Safe Fish brochure, as well as a few other options. Our website is super helpful too, because if there's any interim updates between guides, we're able to update our website with some more real-time information. So if there's anything pertinent, we're able to put it up on our website to get news to the public. But again, I think it's important to have our information on all avenues. It's something that people can pull our guides up from their phone, from anywhere. And again, it's easily accessible to everybody. One of my favorite things on our website is actually our Kids Corner. And one of the ways we get out to the public is starting with our youth. We have presentations, a specific presentation called Order Up. That's kind of a short presentation followed by some fun hands-on activities for kids. So we go to fairs, we've gone to libraries, we've gone again where we can with kids to get this information in their hands too and make it easily accessible to them. We have again kids specific and that age group specific tools that we're able to give out and give. And again, they live on our website. We have hard copies of them. We try to give them all the options to get this information to all sorts of people. And then I think this is my last slide, but this is one of my favorite ways that we get out and are able to share all of our important guidelines with the public. Michigan has a River Walker program, and this is a seasonal program which starts in April and goes through October, which is like our peak fishing season here in Michigan. And the currently is located in like 4 areas: our Saginaw, Detroit, Huron River, and Kalamazoo River areas. And what these people do is they're boots on the ground people. So they're walking these water bodies. They're going to popular fishing destinations along these water bodies, and they are bringing Eat Safe Fish information to the anglers that are there and that are fishing and that may not know that we have guidelines for that water body or for that area. And so this program has been going on for a few years, and they talk with thousands of anglers a year. They pass out hundreds of promo items and brochures and Eat Safe Fish guides and make really good connections with these people and these watersheds and these communities about safe, Eat Safe Fish guidelines and consumption and everything. We get great feedback from the community. We're able to use that feedback in some of our health education materials and ways to get out and about. But this has been one of our most exciting programs here in getting out and getting the word out in Eat Safe Fish and fish consumption guidelines. So that is another tool that we use to get out. And with that, I think that is the end of my presentation. So I will stop sharing and appreciate being able to talk to you all.
Amazing. Thank you all so much for presenting and for sharing so much great information. Again, last reminder, and if you didn't see in the chat that Lacey sent, the Q&A function might be a little hidden. We apologize for that. If you don't see the Q&A option, you can click more on the bottom toolbar and then select Q&A if the icon is not automatically popping up. Either way, please drop your questions now into the chat, and we will go ahead and start to answer those. I will give the caveat. Katie usually does this pitch, but just so that everybody keeps it in mind and remembers, you do not have to feel like you have to ask the most scientifically expert question you could possibly come up with. Most of us on this call facilitating are social scientists, and so we are not necessarily dealing with the technicalities day in and day out. So there are truly no dumb questions. Please ask anything that comes to mind. And we will kind of all do our best to answer them, but obviously want Brandon, Carly, and Erica to take the first crack at our questions. So I see a question here from Virginia. Does MDHHS use the Great Lakes Consortium best practice for PFAS guidelines for PFAS advisories? This is then Virginia links to the document. So curious if any of the 3 of you have encountered this document before and if it's used at all and what you do.
I will say I'm not sure if we use that document. We do work with the Great Lakes Fish Consortium. We are a part of that group along with a few other of our partners. So that is something we're aware of. I think I don't think we use that currently. I think we use our our value, which is it might be a little bit more protective, but don't quote me on that. But I do not think we use it, but we are a part of that group, and that is something that we are aware of.
Out of my own curiosity, is there any more, Carly, that you can say about how you might use that guidance if you do choose to going forward?
So I'm not sure. And I will preface this with I am the program manager. We do have two toxicologists on site who kind of deal more with that science stuff. So I want everything I say technically to be taken with a grain of salt just because I'm not 100% sure on that. The Great Lakes Fish Consortium is a group. It's a group of many states. And so everyone kind of uses that document in different ways, whether it's a reference or whether they use it as more than that. And so I think every state kind of reads it and uses it how they see fit. And so it is again something we're aware of and something that we reviewed and looked at. I think we do use our own processes to set up our fish consumption guidelines here in Michigan.
So we have another question, one specifically about how is the River Walkers program funded?
Mm-hmm.
And then what I'd like to hear more about then to broaden it out is talking about resources for all of your work more broadly. And so like, what does it take? What's the manpower like, Brandon, to do the kind of sampling protocol you mentioned? Like my eyes lit up when you were like, oh, people can submit requests to have sampling done. I was like, how many people do you have? So if each of you could talk a little bit about kind of like the resources and the woman and manpower it takes to do the work you talked about, and then specifically the River Walkers program. I cannot say an R and a W next to each other.
I'll go ahead and do the River Walker one, then hand it over to Brandon because I too thought the same thing. I'm like, you guys sample how many water bottles? They're everywhere. But for the River Walker program, it is I think Brandon mentioned in his presentation the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. It's a GLRI funded program, or River Walkers are. So they've been funded for a few years, and so that's the funding behind those River Walkers, and that's how we get the resources to be able to employ those people to go
That's
out
a state pot of money. What's GLRI?
No, so the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative is a separate entity from the state. So it's somewhere you can go to get various projects funded. So it's a separate entity from the state. They just tend to fund various statewide things, I think, all throughout our area, not just in Michigan.
It's appropriated through Congress. Just want to add to that.
Thank you.
Yeah, so to get at the the manpower behind fish contaminant monitoring, we're a program of 3 staff. It's me and a couple biologists. So we get to about 60 to 70 water bodies, ourselves each year, and then we really rely heavily on the Michigan Department of Natural Resources, the tribes, and some of our federal partners. There's a lot of fish population surveys happening throughout the state. So every year we share monitoring program plans with the Fish Division of Michigan Department of Natural Resources. We share it with the tribes. We share them with the federal partners, and they also share their monitoring plans with me. I'll take a look at where they're going to be collecting fish through those fish population surveys and say, hey, we have a need for this particular lake that you're going to get to. Can you save us 10 bluegill for contaminant monitoring? So overall, between Eagle's efforts and those external partners, we were right around 90 to 100 water bodies of samples, roughly around 2,000 fish going to the lab each year.
Yeah,
and that number seems to be exponentially increasing as more people become aware of PFAS contamination.
So I imagine that has to ebb and flow a bit. So do you feel like there are times where you're getting a ton of samples in, but you don't have the bandwidth to analyze yet and use some sort of freezing system?
Yeah, we can. So we've got a lot of freezers set up. we sometimes those fish can sit in our freezers for a few months, but for the most part, we don't take more fish in than we can analyze in a particular year, because it's a lot harder to explain. This fish has been sitting in our freezer for 4 years, and we're just now getting around to analyzing it.
Yeah.
So it's a
Yeah.
lot easier if we can just do a year at a time.
Yeah, I ask because, well, one, I can see that a lot of folks that are on the Zoom right now are people from our state agencies. And so one, hi friends, and if I mischaracterize anything, just put it in the Q&A because I am one to do that. But one of the things we've been talking, us at NC State and our friends at Duke have talked with these folks a lot about over the years is like how we can do kind of what you just described in the absence of all of the resources and employees and manpower in the world to do what it would take to really assess every water body in the state frequently enough to do what you would want if you wanted the most robust advisory strategy. And so one of the things we've talked about often is like, well, there are so many scientists and anglers and fishing groups that could collect samples for us. And then could we freeze them and then leverage that in the future? And so it's nice to hear that it sounds like Michigan has kind of figured out a system where that works well. And so North Carolina folks, chime in if there are more specifics you want about that and thinking about how we might be able to do a similar model here. Like I know Duke has put together a manual to help people collect samples in a way that then the state would be able to use for advisories. And I think we just are in the beginning stages of figuring out how to leverage that all. And so relatedly, I'd love to hear from the three of you ways that state groups and then nonprofit type groups like the Ecology Center and maybe academics have worked together in this fish consumption advisory process in your state, given that everyone has different kind of like resources and strengths at their disposal. So either if there have been things that worked really well or things that didn't work well and you would suggest people in North Carolina not try.
Yeah, one example that comes to mind, back in 2021, the state of Wisconsin issued a consumption advisory for Lake Superior rainbow smelt due to PFOS. I think the advisory at that time was down to 1 meal per month due to high PFAS concentrations that they were seeing in rainbow smelt. So then once we found out about that, through the Great Lakes Consortium, Michigan adopted a plan to go out and collect rainbow smelt ourselves, and we were also seeing very high PFAS concentrations in rainbow smelt. And rainbow smelt are really small, forage fish type, really short-lived species that are only going to live a few years. They're the forage base for a lot of the Great Lakes fish. And the odd thing was, while rainbow smelt were found with really high PFAS concentrations, things that were eating the smelt were really low. Things like lake trout had really low PFAS concentrations. So it didn't quite make sense on why rainbow smelt were having such high PFAS concentrations. So we did reach out to a lot of our partners, talked with the tribes, and it was really the Bay Mills Indian community that really set forth, questioning the lab data. They sent in their own rainbow smelt samples to another lab and came back with really low concentrations in the smelt. So, through that collaboration, talking with a lot of academic researchers up in the UP, Upper Peninsula of Michigan, talking with the tribes, talking with the Michigan Department of Natural Resources in Wisconsin, we were able to figure out over several years that it was a lab method that was resulting in very erroneously high PFAS concentrations in those rainbow smelt. So we were able to get the lab method corrected, and luckily be able to tell the anglers that PFAS concentrations aren't as high as what we had originally thought.
Kind of to go off what Brandon said, I think a big reason why we're able to be as robust and as successful at Michigan is just the group atmosphere and the communication we keep between each state agencies. As Brandon showed at the beginning of his slideshow, we have a few kind of statewide groups we meet at, one being that FOCAT group, which brings together, Eagle and DNR and us and our lab and everyone who kind of has a piece of that. And I think that constant communication, that constant being able to kind of divvy up work and see what people are able to do keeps it manageable for each of the groups that we're able to, take our chunk and do our chunk and come together to kind of continually process improve. And I think that's one thing that I've tried really hard as the program manager is to continually ask like what can we do better for the next year? Because like you said, I mean, it's such a big program. We're doing tons of things. We're testing, we're engaging with the community. There's so many ways that things can slip through the cracks. And so I think that constant communication and that constant question of like what we can do better has made us sustainable and made us, be able to keep improving with new ideas and new things and testing more water bodies. So I think getting together with those people that can help you start, piecing together this is really important. And I think that's brought us a lot of success and teamwork here in Michigan.
I mean, can I ask a logistics of that? Like, are you guys having regular meetings between this multi-stakeholder group, or is it like more
Yeah.
informal over email?
We meet in a few different ways, and I think I can only speak for myself. I
Yeah,
don't know if Eagle meets separately, but I know there's quarterly meetings and there's monthly meetings. And so the quarterly meetings are kind of with a bigger group with like more overarching, and then we are meeting monthly with the boots on the ground, the lab, and
right.
getting updates on storage and the sampling plan and that type of stuff. So and then, even within Michigan or in MDHHS, we're meeting weekly with our program team, in our on season and in our off season. And I think I tend to maybe over meeting things, but I think that constant communication can be super beneficial for such a large program like this is.
Yeah, yeah. Erica, what about from your perspective as far as, working with state groups? I mean, your map, I was like, oh my God, outlining political boundaries. That's something a state agency could never do, but is super powerful. So tell us more about that
Yeah.
collaboration.
Yeah, well, I wanted to mention too, one of, a big role that we have is working with community members and community groups. And the state has the Michigan PFAS Action Response Team. And through that, there's a citizen advisory work group. And so people who are impacted by PFAS have an opportunity to meet monthly with the director of that. It's an interagency group and give, feedback, give recommendations or suggestions of where they would like to see things tested, fish and other environmental media. So it's an important part of the work, I think, is that feedback loop, hearing from people who are living, like I was talking about in my presentation, people who are living in those particular impacted water bodies around there. So that's just one thing I wanted to highlight that we have in Michigan. And the other part is just the work, of kind of being on the outside of the state, right? I'm with an NGO, a nonprofit, so we're funded privately through foundations and donors, and so we do things that are really advocacy based. We use the state's research, and we have communicated with the state about the advisories, and when we were doing the study, and I think it's helpful to have that outside kind of angle, because then we could take a lot of the data that's coming out of the state and use it to not just communicate risk, which is really important that people understand what they should be eating and paying attention to, but also kind of getting to the root causes of why we have contamination and what are some policy initiatives that we need to do, and get people to take action around it in the legislature, that we can do in regulatory agencies. So it's about individual action, which is always what people want to know, and it's really important. And then we look at it as a broader like systems problem, that we have these chemicals in the first place, and what can we do to move the markets or move industries or have policy changes that phase out these harmful chemicals. So I work a lot on policy and bringing communities into that discussion too, and using maps and tools to do that.
So we're wanting to shift a bit, and it goes hand in hand with the question that Zach Shepard put in the chat. This is something that we obviously grapple with a lot here in North Carolina, is the fact that eating fish also has health benefits. So would love for all of you, some of you to speak to that idea. Like, how do we balance the fact that eating fish when it has contaminants in it, specifically PFAS, is obviously a detriment to one's health, with the fact that there are obvious health benefits to eating fish. How do you set, and specifically Zach is asking, how do you choose reference dose values for PFAS in fish based on that context?
I can get started. So again, my program is consisted of two program toxicologists, and they look into that reference dose and that type of stuff. And there's also a bigger group. We talk about it, at our monthly meetings and bring in other points of view. But we're always looking at the most, updated, emerging, consistent science. Last year, Michigan updated our reference dose for PFAS, and it was 14, and we dropped it all the way to 2.89, so around 6 times lower than previous. And again, this is all because we know more, and sometimes knowing more means that we are choosing a more restrictive or a lower reference dose value. Our science was just giving us all these our different health endpoints, and we choose the most protective one for the people here in Michigan. And so sometimes, unfortunately, the science leads us to be more restrictive, but we're just trying to make, the safest guidelines out there for Michigan. But we always try to stress that eating fish is healthy and eating fish is good. Again, we have that page on our website. Most of our brochures and our guides talk about the benefits of eating fish, the omega-3 fatty acids, the lean protein. There are so many benefits. And so we never try to say that this is like a rule that like you can't use. Again, our recommendations use with, what you want. But it's that, we maybe not eat this, but eat this. We always try to offer a solution to like, maybe we have to be more restrictive of this, but look at this option or look at this water body. So I think it's redirecting that, not all the time is the answer the best, where we are limiting consumption, but I think we always try to show that there's other options out there, and we never want to forget again that there are health benefits to eating fish. Unfortunately, sometimes the science just makes it more restrictive.
Yeah, and I'll just add, we don't do the reference dose. We don't, do that toxicology. We do a lot of the communication. And that is something that at the Ecology Center has struggled with around that very message, that it's culturally, appropriate for people. It's sustenance. It's what some people rely on for meals. So it's a really delicate message, I think, when we are talking about eat this, don't eat that, or eat, but we do, I think, as I was trying to say in the presentation, like it's important for people to have information and then be able to make choices for themselves. And I think also hearing it from people who are also fishing in those water bodies, like the River Walker program is great, and that they trust, and that someone that they know has information, but like understands that it can be challenging to be told not, or advised to do something. So there's really no clear answer, but it is something we've thought a lot about, is how to message in a way that's appropriate.
So building on this idea of messaging and different types of groups and institutions, different messaging. I don't know how familiar y'all are with North Carolina and our PFAS and our fish, but so again, state folks, if I mischaracterize anything, chime in the Q&A. But we have a well-known issue with PFAS contamination in our Cape Fear River Basin. And right now we have an advisory that is just the lower part of the Cape Fear River, because that's where the fish were sampled from. And again, it's based on the PFOS levels. So from the state perspective, they are only allowed to make official authoritative claims based on where they collected the fish from in that lower section of the river. But the Cape Fear River shed is our largest watershed in the state. And so we know that there is PFAS contamination all the way up the river, but we don't have advisories for that area yet. So I'm curious if you all have any experience with a situation like this, where there likely would be an advisory based on what you know about the rest of the water body, but there isn't one yet, so the state can't say anything. And how you kind of work in these kind of like gaps between knowledge and official, like state level policies, not the right word, but advisory setting. And if you have any recommendations for us down here.
Yeah, I think a good example of that is when back in 2018, we got fish data back for one impoundment of the Huron River, pretty far upstream in the watershed at Argo Pond. Came back really high concentrations, far exceeding at that time the do not eat advisory of 300 part per billion. And DHHS made the conservative determination just to apply it to the entire watershed downstream of that particular water body. And then as we start to collect more and more fish, throughout the watershed, they were able to, then update, based off the new data, whether or not that advisory needed to continue to go further upstream or further downstream. And then, once we were able to find the source, and we were able to address the source, concentrations in the fish started to come down, then we were able to collect data for them to, be confident in relaxing that do not eat advisory for parts of the river. So I guess, to get at your question, we didn't just issue it for that one impoundment. We applied it, conservatively across downstream, including the downstream reach.
I have a question that might take us in a slightly different direction. Katie, if there's anything else on this train of thought that you would like to
Well,
ask.
I was just wondering, Erica, from your perspective, like, have you encountered this issue where there isn't an official advisory yet, but you likely need to provide protective guidance to people, and what does that look like?
Yeah, and we always refer people back to the Eat Safe Fish Guide. That is, formally, we always tell people that is like what you should follow, what the state's recommendations are. Um, one one thing I'm thinking about when we were doing that study that I was talking about on the Rouge River, and that's a pretty industrialized area. Um, and there was a lot of discussion about where to sample and collect and where people fish on that river. And while we were doing that study, there was some new advisories that were set forth. This was like in 2022. So Carly and Brandon may recall on the Rouge River. But we didn't have those at the time. So it was an interesting kind of like in real time trying to figure out where we should go and collect. And people always have lots of questions for us. So yeah, we try and work with people as best we can in the moment and in the exact location, but we're not the ones putting out the advisories. We're trying to help people get to the right place and communicate about kind of the broader sense of the issues. So that's just one example I can think of. Yeah.
Yeah, and the other good thing about, at least with the state of Michigan, is we don't have any waters that don't have any consumption advisories. The MDHHS does have that statewide mercury guideline that applies to all waters that we have not sampled. So when you're tackling an emerging contaminant like PFAS and we don't have any data, then it's always something that the anglers can fall back on, is following that mercury guidance until the new PFAS data become available.
Great. And encourage people in the last few minutes, 15 minutes that we have left, keep dropping questions as you have them. My question is one that I think about a lot and one that we have not necessarily explored too much about, but curious if you all have. When we're talking about best practices for communication, I think we can and do a lot on the back end where we're developing practices and sort of basing them a lot of times on existing literature, other entities, etc. Do you all do anything or know anything about metrics? Is there any way to sort of determine if communication is working, if best practices for communicating these advisories is working? Um, Again, coming from a place of like, we have not necessarily done anything in that vein, but I personally am always curious about if that exists anywhere.
From Eagle's perspective, we don't have any metrics, but I think those face-to-face interactions that we're seeing at the youth fishing events, a lot of times it's the kids' first time catching a fish. So a lot of the parents weren't at that time weren't a bit understanding of the consumption advisory. So having that face-to-face interaction with the public, being able to explain why there's chemicals in the fish and why you need to be aware of them and follow the consumption advisories. And I think, outside of metrics, I think that's the most important piece is having that face-to-face interaction and not just solely relying on a website.
Yeah. And I will say we collect a decent amount of metrics at the state of Michigan. We could of course look at like our website and see the traffic, on our guides and kind of watch did our press release go out? Did it reach a bunch of people? Did we have a spike when our guides went out? We also get metrics from our outreach team and how many pamphlets they're handing out, how many events they're attending, and then our river walkers also report to us as well. How many anglers are talking to, how many people. So we're not necessarily seeing, how many people necessarily are using the information we're giving them, but we do have a good, check on, how many people are receiving our stuff or how many times we're out there sharing our information. So those are the metrics we're able to track is how many times we're attempting out there in the public. So not so much how many people are actually using it, but how many times we're giving opportunity to use our information.
And I'll add too, when this is a little bit related to metrics, although not directly answering your question, is we have relationships with reporters and they'll, really get very interested when there's new guidelines that come out, or when we did the map, we, tried to get some articles on that. And so that is an important way too to connect with the community, is trying to get into local media outlets around what, and that too allows you to explain the bigger issue. Like there are these advisories and here's what's going on and here's why and here's some policies. So we look at it as what is the story that we're trying to tell and how are we using the data and information to create that bigger narrative that people can connect to.
If the three of you were starting your own state, the 51st state of the US, what things do you feel are necessary to ensure a state has a robust fish consumption monitoring, advisory setting, and communication process?
I'll start with, you need funding. We're in the state of Michigan, we're really fortunate to have state-backed funding as well as being able to apply for those GLRI federal funds to, as we see more increasing requests for fish contaminant monitoring. 10 years ago, we were only getting to 20 sites. Now we're up to about 90 to 100 sites a year. You need funds to be able to analyze those fish. So having a state committed funding source and then also being able to tap into some of those federal funds is definitely needed.
I think having a good process before action starts, I think there's a lot of steps that go into it. I mean, I don't even know the half of the steps that go into Eagle's organization of visiting all these water bodies and all that type of stuff. But there's a lot of logistics that are a part of it. And I think having a pretty like robust, like how we're gonna again manage all those little things that you're not sure about, like who's gonna process it, how are they going to process it, what's that method they're going to use, where are we going to store it, where are we going to store overflow, how are we going to handle if we get an emergency, where a fish comes back and it's sky high, like what are our steps for that. And so I feel like it's probably a lot of like work beforehand before you can kind of hit the ground running, but I find process and process improvement makes what we do a little bit easier.
Yeah, and I'll chime in, from the communications perspective. I think surveying how people are, receiving information and it's really changing a lot right now. I think where people are getting their information and how they are is we would really want to stay up to date so that things that if people want things printed, the state has things printed, but if they want it digitally and downloadable and there's a map and there's maybe an app that people can have to look, because people are always using apps and looking at their phones now. how are we evolving that type of communication to what people are, doing online, really, on social media? And it's just, I don't analyze all of that, but I know that that type of communication is important, because if you're not even getting it to them in the first place, I think that's really how do they want to receive that information would be a good survey and question to ask.
Yeah. And again, all of this, as Brandon mentioned, requires funding. And so I'm curious, how how have you managed to do that at the state level? So not even applying for the Great Lakes pot of money, but North Carolina, like Michigan, is a purple state. So one of the things that the royal we in North Carolina have struggled with is cuts to funding and resources for our Department of Environmental Quality and our Department of Health and Human Services, which just cuts the number of people who can actually do this work. And so I'm curious what you all have found as successful for ensuring state support for this work, whether that's how it's framed to legislatures or any other strategies.
Yeah, so I'm fortunate that when I took over the program, a lot of those decisions have already been made. So I'd have to give credit to the people that had the program before me, and a lot of department leads that have really advocated for state funds to support Eagle as a whole, not just the fish contaminant monitoring program.
Yeah, I don't know the answer exactly. What comes to mind is, when we talk about our issues and getting, budgets and things, leading with clean water and Great Lakes water, it's resonates with everyone. And there's many people who fish and who hunt in Michigan. And so, when you start talking in those terms, and it's not necessarily about, I don't know, always lead with like, let's ban PFAS from consumer products. Even though there is a link to that, it's not really palatable for a lot of people because for various reasons. So, but really leveraging our Great Lakes and the love that people have for clean water and going out to a Great Lake, that is something we can all connect on. And so I often start there.
So speaking of sort of ideological tensions that might exist, something we struggle with here, and curious if you all do as well, and how you deal with it, is the tensions that exist sometimes between you know, fishing industry, tourism, and trying to get fish consumption advisories out into the world. Do you deal with any of those challenges, and if so, how do you overcome them?
From a sampling perspective, when there's a do not eat advisory and they see us out on the lake collecting fish, it just, having those conversations and listening to their concerns, I think goes a long way, rather than just slapping a website up and saying, don't eat the fish, and being able to interact with them, explain what we can and can't do about the contamination issue, what we're trying to do about the contamination, and just being open and truthful with the anglers goes a long way with relaxing those tensions.
Yeah. That's what I was going to say. I think our most successful routes have often been our river walkers who are there and can have a conversation with these people. Because a lot of the time, like you said, it's their culture, it's their livelihood, it's the meals on the table, it's their passion, it's what they did with their grandpa. Like, and it can be hard to look at someone and tell them, well, that we don't recommend that. And I think that human interaction that any of us can give any of these people is super important. And then again, I just always reiterate it's a recommendation, and that no one's forcing you to follow these. We're doing it to try to help. And I think sometimes people can think that a recommendation is a law, and it's not that. So I think explaining what again the guides are used for, and always having that human element of understanding, because it wouldn't be easy to hear that's something you love to do could be taken or is dangerous.
Do you get any sort of active pushback though from tourism interests or from industry interests, or are you finding that you're mostly just sort of, you know, being a little offensive yourselves and having these conversations just to make sure that everything's copacetic? Do you have any active pushback?
I wouldn't say from tourism or anything that we get active pushback. I think most of the
Hmm.
pushback we get tends to come from certain individuals or maybe groups of
Okay.
people who have been doing this for a while, but it tends to be more community or citizen based than a group or tourism based.
Got it. Understood.
Yeah, and I guess, having that communication piece, there's a lot of misconceptions with the advisories that we tend to like to discuss with individuals that we run out on the water. A lot of times they think, we're just grinding up the entire fish, and, the advisories don't really apply to, how they eat the fish. So, we do explain that we are looking at just fillet concentrations and not using whole fish data for those advisories. Other times they, say, well, I cut off the fat, so the advisories don't apply to me. While that's true for, PCBs, that doesn't mean that PCBs aren't going to be in the fillet if you cut out the body fat or the belly fat. And that also doesn't apply to mercury and PFOS. So I think, some of those misconceptions that go around with the advisories is, having those face-to-face interactions and answering questions goes a long way.
I will also, just to cut in, I think one thing that we can also communicate to people is that the guideline today isn't the guideline for next year or 3 years.
Mm.
Guidelines ebb and flow. We have guidelines become more restrictive. We have guidelines that become less restrictive as we try to help the contamination. And so I think it's also important to stress to people that this isn't always. This is our 2025 guideline. Our 2026 guideline could be completely
Mhm.
different based on what we see. And so there always is a chance of, positive change, but there is that chance of negative change. I think giving them that option that this isn't concrete may make people feel better to know that this isn't forever.
Yeah,
That's a really good point.
with individuals, I've tried to redirect if there's tension or anger, I've tried to redirect it because it's not the state putting out the Eat Safe Fish Guide that's really the problem. I mean, they're trying to do health protective things. It's that we have these contaminants. And so thinking about why are we doing this? Why do we have guidelines in the first place? We need them, but we shouldn't really need them. We shouldn't have to
Mm.
have them.
Mhm.
And thinking about it from that root cause and just getting people to take one step down, one step, towards like what industry or, how can we actually demand safer chemicals? So that's a little bit from the Ecology Center's kind of advocacy point of view.
Yeah, these are all really, really excellent points. We're getting close to time here. Just wanting to make sure that there are no lingering questions from attendees. And if not, we'll ask the three of you to share any last bit of wisdom that you want to leave us with, anything that you are particularly proud of in the work that you do currently or will continue to do in the future. So best pieces of advice, things that they're proudest of.
I will say I'm so excited to be here and to have this conversation with you. I started as the Eat Safe Fish program manager about 2 years ago, and I have grown to love all things Eat Safe Fish. So I'm always excited to talk about it. As I mentioned, our website, feel free, my contact information's on there, as well as our health educator, I believe, who makes a lot of these great things I was talking to you about. And our toxicologists are on there as well for if you have any more technical questions. So I really emphasize looking at our website and reaching out if you have any direct questions. But we, I always look forward to talking about this stuff. So I was just appreciative to be here, and I think that's all.
Thanks, Carly.
I guess one thing that we didn't really talk about is, why, these are forever chemicals, and, people hear that there's a do not eat advisory and forever chemical. They think that these advisories are going to last forever. And, what we've seen, at least in the state of Michigan, when there's a point source and you can address that point source, surprisingly, fish concentrations can fairly quickly come down. Going back to that Huron River example, 2018, we collected fish and we saw really high, like 1,500 part per billion. PFOS concentrations in Kent Lake. They were able to figure out the source was a plating operation that was sending wastewater to a wastewater treatment plant, and it was getting out into the creek. So they were able to use granular activated carbon to remove the PFAS contamination, or at least reduce the PFAS contamination from reaching the wastewater treatment plant. And within a year, there was a 90% reduction in PFAS in the surface water. And those fish quickly responded. Within a year, they went from 1,500 part per billion down to 300 part per billion. And so while these are forever chemicals, if you can address the source and control the source, the system does seem to quickly recover. Unfortunately, there's still do not eat advisory because, as we start to learn more about PFOS, the goalpost has changed. We're seeing that this chemical is a lot more toxic than we had previously thought. So fish consumption screening values are coming down at the same rate around that the concentrations of the fish are coming down. But so there is hope on the horizon that if you can control the source, that these fish will recover and they aren't going to be contaminated forever.
Totally. Thanks for leaving us with some hope, Brandon.
Sure.
Erica, any last thoughts?
Yeah, no, thank you for having me in the conversation. As an advocate and someone who thinks a lot about public health and how to communicate things, it feels personal because the river that Brandon was just mentioning is my river, the Huron River. And so I use that all the time, and I'm on there and I see people fishing. And so a lot of things that we talk about in our work professional life, like it's very much part of our lives and in our communities, and people talk about these places. So anything that kind of can get people to just not see it as something that's really affecting them personally, and understand how it affects them, and they can explain. I was talking about narratives and storytelling. I think that is the thing that I really try and bring out of people. Why do we love the river, and why do we want to protect it in the first place, and what are the things that we need to do that? So I just appreciate being able to have that conversation with everyone, and I learned a lot too from others. Thanks.
Great. Thank you all. For those of you who have stuck around, just quickly, we want to say thank you again for attending. And just know that there will be a little survey link that pops up when you close out of Zoom. And please take our short survey. It will also come to you as an email to the email you registered with. And again, that's the closeout of our three-part series. So thank you especially to any folks who have attended all three. We are going to meet sort of as a planning committee and figure out next steps as far as a summary document or some way of getting all of the pertinent information out to everyone who attended. But thank you again. Thank you to our panelists. And my email and Lacey's email are up here if there are any additional questions or follow-up that you all have. Thank you so much.
Thank you.